Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. We're just going to give it a couple minutes and wait for a few more folks to join, and then we will go ahead and get started. For folks who are just joining, we're just going to give it a minute or two before we get started. Great. I think we have enough to go ahead and get started. So welcome all to our Tech Talk with Dapper Labs. My name is Sajith. I'm on the deployed engineering team here at Retool, and we're joined today by Anna Zhao. She's an engineering manager on the internal tools team at Dapper Labs. So I've been fortunate enough to have been able to work with Anna and the rest of her team for about a year now, and we're really excited to dig into how Retool has helped shape Dapper's approach to internal tools and establish a culture that's built on operational excellence. A little bit of context on Dapper Labs. They're a blockchain-based company that creates digital experiences like NBA Top Shot and CryptoKitties. Their Retool story begins back in 2020 when they first launched their now signature product, which is NBA Top Shot. So Top Shot is an NFT marketplace that basically hit virality overnight. It had over 1 million registered users and $1 billion transacted within the first year. Today, Ann and I are going to dig into the behind the scenes of this story and how this launch actually spurred a much larger organizational shift at Dapper Labs. So I've prepared a few questions that will help to guide our conversation, after which Anna will share some of the tools her team has built, and we'll finish with the live audience Q&A. We will be sure to record the session, so if you have to leave or drop off, we'll be sure to share it with all registrants after. And as you have questions, please use the Q&A little toggle in the Livestorm chat, and then we'll be sure to get to it after. With that, let's go ahead and jump right in. Anna, I would like to start with you. Can you give us a quick introduction of yourself, the team that you currently manage, and then where that team sits within the broader organization?
Sure. Thank you so much for the introduction and also for having me here today. And also thank you to everyone in the chat for the warm welcome. So as you've mentioned, I'm currently the engineering manager on our internal tooling team here at Dapper Labs. In addition to myself, we have 6 talented engineers on the team as well. And some of them are actually in the webinar today. So feel free to say hi to them. And if you see them jumping in to answer questions, that's my team at work. Our team is a fully engineering-based team. We don't have a dedicated product or design resource. This is not uncommon for internal tooling teams, but I will explain a little bit later on why this works so well for us. I also want to highlight how new our team is as well. So we actually made our first hires for the internal tooling team last summer. Most of those hires are still with us today, and we've kind of just scaled since. I'll also expand on what inspired this dedicated tooling team later as well. So currently we operate as a centralized tooling team, ironic for a crypto company. We are a single team that serves multiple pillars and departments in the organization. So while we have other teams that build tools as well, we service a large majority of the teams at our company. We collaborate with customer support, compliance, fraud, live operations, marketing, partnerships, the list just goes on and on. We collaborate with all of these teams to streamline their workflows, and we're just getting started.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And I'm sure we'll get into a lot more of these details on the team a little bit later today. But I want to scale out and I want to talk about this NBA Top Shot launch that I gave a little bit of context on, but I want to dig a little bit deeper and hear about what this actually looked like from the inside. From your perspective, what were some of the operational challenges that you saw emerge when you first launched this product?
Sure. So when we launched Dapper Labs, we had this mission of making blockchain technology and cryptocurrency accessible to the masses. At the end of 2020, we launched the product you've mentioned, NBA Top Shot, which, as the name suggests, is a collaboration with the NBA. The product really took off. I think the combination of crypto collectibles and just it being a major sports league, it really resonated with people. By the spring of 2021, so this would be last year, we were setting various records when it came to the volume of transactions, the number of dollars being transacted, the amount a single NFT sold for. We had a single day in February where we transacted $5 million on our marketplace, spread across 77,000 transactions. That was just in one day. So we've actually gone on to since break a lot of the records that we've set ourselves, if I can show off a little bit. So with the volume of transactions and site activities, I think certain gaps in our workflow just really began to surface. One example of this was with answering customer support emails. This is quite a simple example, but when you have thousands of support tickets flying in, the approach that you take to resolve these really has to change. When we were getting a handful of tickets a day, it was easy to address each one ad hoc and just have engineers jump on to answer technical questions or debug issues. But when our support inbox reached thousands and then tens of thousands of tickets, we had to revisit this approach and just develop something more robust. So our support staff at the time really didn't have tools to surface the relevant information to them. Our engineers didn't have tools to perform repeated operational tasks and so on. We came across Retool when you guys actually reached out to us. It was the perfect timing. We were looking for a tooling solution, and a product like Retool really wasn't on our radar, but we knew that there was something missing in our workflow. So we had a couple engineers test it out, and I think we were just blown away by how quickly we were able to get up and running. I remember at the time, I think we were able to connect our production databases and have simple visualizations built out in a matter of, I think it was maybe a day. So even though at the time we didn't have an overall strategy to tooling, we knew we had these acute needs that we had to address as quickly as possible. We saw that Retool was just really easy to set up, implementation and deployment, everything was just really easy. So it really, I think, solidified our decision that this was something we wanted to try out. Just to quickly answer the question in the chat. So we do use Zendesk to answer our support tickets. We use Retool as sort of a supplementary tool to surface information to do so.
Cool. Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, and I've also seen some of these tools, and we can touch a little bit more on how they use it with Zendesk. And the story you mentioned, it really resonates with me because at Retool, we also work with a number of customers that have products that are seeing this sort of exponential growth or hyper growth, but they don't always have the requisite internal tooling to support this at scale. So sometimes this is due to a lack of existing tooling in place, or they might have just custom built applications that might not scale or be as maintainable as need be, or it just might be a bespoke other software solution that is not tailored for the need at the time. So this actually leads into the next question I have for you, which is around the state of tooling for Dapper Labs at the time of launch. So at that time, was there already a strategy in place for addressing these gaps? And then how do you think the launch actually influenced this vision?
For sure. So we definitely didn't have a strategy in place when it came to tooling. I think we were a lot more tactical than strategic at the time. So we knew we had these operational challenges. We didn't have a dedicated tooling team or even dedicated tooling engineers. We really weren't thinking about building out custom tooling for our workflows until it was essentially too late and we were sort of at the point of we really needed it. So we did try to work with the tools we had. So we, had our customer support team rely on things like Google Data Studio, Google Sheets to access information in our databases. If you've ever used either of these products, you can imagine this was not ideal. At one point, I would log on every day, run my database queries, and then paste the newest rows onto a Google Sheet that was just growing and growing so the CS team could access the latest data. It's hard to believe this was our solution, but it was as painful as it sounds. We also had a small React app that was essentially built by one engineer. This was so that our team on the admin side could perform certain admin level actions. This app was very small scale, but we still had to manage things like the deployments of the app, the infrastructure of the app, and we just found it wasn't a great use of our time. So as a company, we knew we were really pretty much just getting started. We had really launched one of our first few products. We knew our products, our user base, our team, everything was going to scale rapidly. So we knew whatever tooling solution we ended up going with, whatever we built, it would have to scale with us. At this time, we kind of decided to start hiring dedicated engineers for this idea of a tooling team. And they actually immediately began to build sort of to address the most obvious gaps in our workflow. One of the things the team tackled first was a user 360 view for the support team. And many iterations later, the latest version of that app is actually probably still our most used Retool app to date. We also migrated that small React app I mentioned into Retool so that everything could be in one place. I think as an organization, we very quickly saw the impact that these tools were making. We saw that with internal tools and engineers building them, they were really multipliers to our efficiency. And I think this is when we hit that inflection point to realize that this was something we needed to continue to invest in. So we began to shift from building tools to patch gaps in our process to holistically examining entire workflows to see what we could optimize with tooling. We saw various examples where a workflow that previously depended on multiple distinct tools and data sources could be consolidated into Retool. There were a lot of efficiency gains there. And we also started to think about how we could scale the process of tool building itself. So how could we take the tools that we had already built and the learnings we gained doing so and spin up tools even faster?
Great. And Anna, quickly, can you touch on some of the workflows that did rely on disparate data sources, like in and out of tools? Like what did that actually look like and what data sources were you relying on?
Sure. So if I can poke fun at ourselves for a little bit, if any of you were on the product last year, you'll know one of our main complaints was how slow we were to approve withdrawals. This is a sore spot. But one of the reasons for this was because we didn't have all the data needed to make a decision on a withdrawal in one place. And then you had to log into another separate app to be able to actually perform that action to approve that withdrawal. So that would be an example of something where now we had it sort of in one central place in Retool so you can see the information you need on the user's account and then perform the action accordingly. We've also built automation behind that as well, but it's also a matter of consolidating those data sources into one place for the team to access. That would be one example. We'll probably get into more in the demo portion of this as well.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks for sharing.
Of course.
What you touched on in your story really makes sense to me, and I think I really want to dig into this inflection point and what you talked about, this kind of shifted mindset. Here at Retool, our goal is to compound developer efficiency, and I think that you're starting to see that as you have a more centralized team dedicated towards these tools. And once you start to really create these more scalable processes, we find that the shifted mindset can also act as the driver for unlocking that value within Retool. And I want to take that into my next question, which is the state of things today. So we talked about the vision, we talked about where you had this customer support need. And if we look at today, you have over 50 apps built on Retool. You have a team that is dedicated to internal tools and applications. And then, of course, you're managing that team. So I'm wondering how you went from this one application to now over 50 serving the broader org, going from that initial use case of the customer support application to an actual platform that is addressing pain points across the broader organization.
Sure. So like I mentioned earlier, I think when we started making this concerted effort to build tooling, we started seeing business value right away. As I mentioned, the impact was really a multiplier and it let us do more with less, which I think is always a priority with these fast moving tech startups. But we recognized pretty early on that in order for this centralized tooling team to support an entire organization, we had to ensure that the tooling efforts themselves also multiplied with each other to create compounding effects. So I think it was obvious to us that there would be natural efficiencies for the end users of these tools. Like I mentioned earlier, when we consolidate different data sources, different places to take actions into one place, there's natural efficiencies that will emerge. But we also saw this on the implementation side as well. For example, when we integrated with certain data sources or we hooked up certain resources into Retool, we could use these over and over again. Apps could be linked with each other, reusable components could be turned into modules and integrated in different places, and so on. This doesn't account for the fact that we also had learnings that we gained from certain tools we built that we would apply to our future work. So in a little bit, I'll show some of the apps that we've built and you'll be able to see this in action. At this point, I think I tried to take a count last night, well over 100 apps in Retool. Our support team is no longer suffering through Google Data Studio, so that's a big win. We've deprecated our previous React admin app, and we're in the process of migrating a bunch of workflows off of Google Sheets as well. That one is a sticky one, but it's definitely a work in progress. We're currently at a point point where we're both backfilling existing workflows with supplemental tooling, but we're also able to support new features as they come out, which is a big win. So we've been able to make that shift from reacting tactically to thinking strategically to determine the types of tools we want to build and how we want to approach tooling as a whole.
Great. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I see a lot of questions both about the hiring process and also the actual migration. And so we'll definitely get into this in the demo, but I wanted to ask one question before that is the actual migration from these other tools. So we talked about Google Sheets. I know you also mentioned a React app. So I just want to just to align. So you had concurrent work streams. Each of them were working on different pieces of migration to Retool. Is that correct?
Exactly. So I wouldn't say the migration process is complete by any means, but we had various different tools, various different workflows in different places, and there were concurrent efforts to migrate those into this one central hub of tooling, which is in Retool.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that. I think it's really helpful to see how you've come so far and gone from the single point to now this platform. I think this is a really great time to maybe go into our demo and share some of the apps that your team has built. So, and if you can maybe discuss the classes of applications that your team has worked on, and then we can walk through some of the details.
Sure, sounds good.
And I think Anna mentioned already, there are a few engineers from the Dapper team on the call. So if there are some questions, maybe we can get some help on some of those details as well.
Yeah, they are the ones that have built all of this, so they would be the best to answer, especially technical questions, but I will get into the demo. So I want to start out by just sharing the sheer number of apps that we have across multiple folders. You'll see here we have some teams and product areas that our tools support. Our team won't take credit for all of this. Many of these folders are owned by specific teams that come into Retool to build niche solutions for their specific workflow. So you can see across all of these folders, lots of apps. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and share some of our most used apps in Retool. Specifically, I want to highlight how we've been able to build apps that are catered to specific teams and their unique needs, but we've minimized duplicated efforts by reusing pieces of tools that are already implemented. So as I mentioned earlier, a user 360 view for our support team was one of the first things we built. This is the latest iteration of that, and it is still our most used app in Retool today. So once I input my username, you'll see a bunch of information on my account come up. You'll notice up here a couple of different ways to look up the account. I saw a couple questions about the Zendesk Retool integration. So you'll be able to actually look up a user by their support ticket number as well. This is really helpful when a user doesn't necessarily write in with the email on their account. This tool allows you to search for pretty much, oh, I'm just gonna pause for a sec. Are you guys able to see the screen share okay? Good. Okay, I see some comments about it. Okay, cool, I'll keep going. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of information in this page here. So it's really important that we sort of kept things organized. So across our different products, we've sort of organized the data into different tabs here. This just ensures that even though we have so much information here, you're not sort of overloaded and you're able to quickly find what you need. We've also implemented quick links. This was a suggestion by our support team. This just allows you to quickly get to the section you need without dealing with vertical scroll. One thing I want to highlight here is how we've been able to incorporate multiple data sources into this tool for one streamlined experience for our support team. So for example, you'll notice here this little footer that says BigQuery data can be a few hours behind. This is because we've actually cached the transactions on a user's account in BigQuery just for performance related reasons, because we can't be fetching all of this every time. But from the end user's perspective, you know, some things are coming live from our production databases, some things come from endpoints, some things are coming from BigQuery and so on from Zendesk, but you see it all in one place. Not only do we incorporate multiple data sources, we also display data in different ways as well. So we have tables with color coding, we have charts and things like that. I also want to mention performance. So one big thing for us was that, you know, if you're visiting a Retool app 50 times a day, any performance gain is a huge multiplier. So a recent change that the team made was they took this component and they made it so that instead of fetching all of this data right as the page loads, you load each section as you click the load buttons. This just ensures that you only see what you need and you're not spending the time to pull data that isn't useful to you. So we saw performance gains there. Next, I want to share a very similar app that's used by an entirely different team. So this is our trust and safety dashboard, and you'll notice that it looks quite similar with certain tweaks. For example, at the top here, we've taken out the ability to search by that Zendesk ticket. That's just not something that this specific team uses. So we find it's extra clutter. We took it out. You'll notice that this component is the same. I'll come back to this one a little bit. And then some of the other components we saw here as well. So the same charts we saw earlier, the same transaction table. If you're super observant, you may notice that the order of the components have changed. So this is just one way that we build for a specific workflow or a specific team. We optimize for what they want to see, but reusing the components and the data sources that we've already built. Once again, this is just to minimize the amount of duplicated effort we have. I want to come back and touch on this module here that we saw in both of the apps that we built. So you'll see this is actually a standalone component that we can now integrate pretty much anywhere we'd like. So one important thing to note here is that when we built in these separate load buttons for those performance gains, all the apps using it got this benefit without us having to build separately again. Lastly, I want to mention that sometimes it's not a matter of reusing the front-end components, but those data sources or those endpoints. So you'll notice here on my account, we can dive into my specific collection of moments, and you can see every NFT that I own. But sometimes you'll want to look up this data globally without looking into a specific user. For example, you may want to look at a moment, but you don't know who owns it. So here, you see we use the same database tables, we use the same queries, the same endpoints, but we're pulling that data globally. We just want to be able to offer the same flexibility that you would get looking at the database directly, but in a way that is a lot more accessible for our teams. It's safer for us because we can limit what specific actions can be taken to modify this data and so on. Awesome. I'm going to pause at this point and see if Sachin wants to.
Yeah, no, these are great, and I like how linked they all are, and how much you're leveraging Retool in a few different ways here. I do want to drill down a little bit more into specifically the support use case. So that was your initial use case that we talked about earlier. So what did it actually look like in the MVP version, and then up to today? How did you actually go about making improvements and taking in user input to make these changes?
Sure, that's a really good question. So I don't have a MVP view of this available. One thing I will say is that I think as we've grown our products and our tools, we're just working with a lot more data. So for example, things like being able to put this into separate tabs, being able to put these quick links, these were not things that we needed when there wasn't as much stuff on the page that we built later on. The performance stuff also came as direct feedback from the support team. They mentioned that, it was a lot of data. Maybe they didn't need all of it all the time. It was taking a bit to load, things like that. Also just very minor things that sometimes you don't think of until you use the tools. For example, we wouldn't have known that lots of people actually write into support with an email address that isn't the one on their account, and they're not aware of their own username. So this is why we have this Zendesk search, so we can pull up that ticket if we want to see the ticket, but then their account might be something else. So just little things like that.
Got it. Yeah. And just to comment, working with Dapper Labs, the one thing I've seen them do really, really well is be able to abstract away common logic into modules and really think critically about the end user. So they're always building with the end user in mind. And I think in this case, we see that the way that they actually isolated their queries, make sure they're only running when they need to, and then wherever they can actually use the same sort of patterns across applications. So like we said, it just compounds efficiency across these applications when you go to this platform scale.
For sure. Yeah, we try to take the approach similar to more traditional development, that we try to modularize what we can. Actually, lots of what you're seeing on the page here are modules. This is a module. These are all modules. This is just because we notice that a lot of teams have similar workflows, but not quite the same. The flexibility of Retool, why not build exactly for their workflow? So we combine these modules in different ways to optimize for each team.
Definitely. And I think this is also a lesson for especially the larger scale applications, some that might be a bit more complex, is really thinking proactively and going with the user in mind first, and then working backwards into how do we best architect this application? Are there areas that we can abstract into a module? Do we need to be loading all of the data at once? Those are types of the considerations that even at Retool, we really think about and want to advise best practices. But I think Dapper has really started to engage and embrace how to think about these applications, how to build with the end user in mind. And I think it really shows across each of their apps. So I think this is a great start in showing the support dashboard, the risk and compliance dashboard, and I'd love to see more if you have them.
Sure, sounds good. So we're going to switch formats a little bit. Just going to make sure you guys can see this. For these last two apps, they do have sensitive information, so we're going to use screenshots instead. So the tools we saw earlier largely focus on surfacing the relevant data to the teams that rely on that information as part of their workflow. Next, I'm going to highlight an app that actually provides a pipeline of actions for the team to perform essentially their entire workflow in the app. So at the heart of the NBA Top Shot are the moments that we sell on the site. They are, to oversimplify, NFTs that capture a particular play from an NBA game. So to create these moments, our live operations team has to wrangle the XML data and the videos that we receive from the league, from the NBA, to create moments that are minted and sold on our site. So as you can see here, not only does the team have the challenge of creating these renders and getting them approved by the league and the Players Association, they also augment that play with various data. So data from the NBA directly, from external APIs, business logic, stats on the play, on the player, things like that for the finished product. So we've created a tool inside of Retool that handles this process. Data is automatically fed in, and then the plays are reviewed by the team. So we've created views that let you review the play, send it to the inventory, add the play to specific collections, set the specific day that we'll be dropping these plays on our site, and so on. One thing I want to point out is that you'll notice that with this view here and the one that we previously saw, it might be hard to see on the screen share, but they're very similar. However, this is a read-only view for our marketing team with filters that are relevant to them. This is the same data with the columns ordered differently, with certain actions you can take and other filters for our curation team. So once again, coming back to that idea of building for specific teams, but making slight modifications both to limit access, to reduce visual clutter, and things like that. So this is another way where we sort of use the same data source, but we're building custom views. Another thing I want to highlight is our approval process with our partners. So for this specific page here, this is a public password protected page that our partners at the NBA can actually access. They can come in here, look at the different assets on the NFT that we've chosen. They can approve, or they can leave us notes, suggestions. They don't have to log in or be in our Retool instance. This is for our partners at the Players Association. So for them, we've created a parsed down view. They only look at these two specific assets on the play. So we have this for them. This is also a public password protected page. This is just an easy way to get them into our workflow without us having to, previously we were sending them a Google sheet of plays, but this is a lot more professional. Lastly, I want to share how this tool consolidates various data sources into one streamlined experience. So for this particular tool, we did deploy databases specifically for this Retool app outside of the databases we have in our NBA Top Shot product. However, we do pull in data from those product databases as well, from external API sources like SportsRadar. We also rely on manual input for business logic. We consolidate all of this into our Retool databases, and then we display this all sort of in one streamlined view for the user. So for our curation team, they're not wrangling with these different data sources. They just see this one view. So here you can see we have a table of our players, as well as sets and teams. This is all the data that's relied on by the rest of the tool, as well as just by our process in general. And we have all of this in here. And lastly, I want to show sometimes the raw data you're working with just might need some tweaking. So that raw data is stored in a Google Cloud bucket, but instead of disrupting our team's workflow by having them log into that to fix a file's metadata, we actually built a file viewer into Retool. So you can rename and archive the files right from Retool, and those changes will be reflected in the rest of the tool. This also helps with access when somebody is in Google Cloud. If you've worked with Google Cloud, it's not the easiest to manage access levels and things like that. In Retool, we lock this down to specific actions that you can take on the metadata. So when users log into the site, they can just come in and they can tackle this entire workflow.
That's great. Love seeing this whole workflow that's in Retool. And I guess the immediate follow-up I have for you is, as you start to scale out to other partners, you might have NFL, UFC, do you think that you're going to be able to reuse any of this sort of logic in those processes as well?
That is a great question. That is the big question. So the idea for sure is that we've built this in a way where we want to ensure we can reuse this across our other IP as well. We really want to take a cross-sport platform approach to our tools, so making minor tweaks to be able to use this on the different products. Currently, we do use this for both NBA and WNBA plays. However, the data structure is a little bit different, for example, for NFL, so there's some work to be done here. We will probably have to make changes on the back end, but for the front end, we will try to reuse as much as possible.
Got it. And another question I have is I've seen some questions in the chat too, is just the project management piece of this. I know we've seen a lot of apps, we see a lot of different workflows here. So how do you actually manage this? And what does that workflow look like from the end user to you, to your team, and then back in that cycle?
Sure. So for this specific tool that we've just shown, this is one of our largest scale products. We do have a dedicated product person from the team that uses the tool, as opposed to the team that builds the tool, that serves as the product resource on this. He consults with the team of end users to ensure that we're incorporating their workflow in. We also rely a lot on their existing workflow, which I'm not able to show, but it lives in Google Sheets, to determine what we want to build. So over time, we will look at streamlining that workflow as a whole, but the first step is to match feature parity with their current tools. So that's one way that we sort of manage that. In terms of the project management piece of this, this is actually built by a combination of an individual on my team and a team of overseas contractors. I'm happy to talk more about this later on, but I'm not sure it's relevant to the wider group, so I'll move on for now.
Great. Yeah. Appreciate you sharing all these tools.
Of course.
And I see that there's a lot of questions around this project management and also the resourcing as well. But if I see that you have another one open here, if you want to jump into that.
Cool. Yeah, so I'll quickly go over this. So earlier we saw an app, that had countless views, multiple database tables, external APIs, a very lengthy and complex workflow. I just want to wrap up our demo by showing something sort of at the other end of the spectrum, something that's simple but still very effective. So when users log onto our site, we want to make sure they always have things to buy. It's not a good experience if you log in and there's nothing for you to purchase. So to address this, we created a bot that checks our inventory levels on a regular interval, and then it pings us on Slack if our stock is running low. So I want to highlight here how we've used Retool to create a better user experience without having to refactor our entire previously existing solution. So this was our first iteration of the inventory bot. It was a Google Sheet. On the left, you can see this is where the team would input the specific internal IDs of the items they wanted to track, as well as the levels they wanted to be notified at. On the right, we printed these warnings onto an ever-growing Google Sheet. This is a pattern with us. And then Zapier would pluck these and send them to Slack. So this was all done by a Google app script that was running in the background. And then this is the Zapier integration, and then it sends us a message on Slack. So coming back to the Retool page, you'll see that it looks quite similar to Google Sheet we saw earlier. The interface is still very much the same. It's still the same inputs, the same warning message, and we're still using that same Google app script and that same Zapier integration, but we have a much nicer interface for the team to work with now. Instead of editing a Google Sheet and it was limited to only a specific number of rows, we have this nice modal for them. They can come in, they can enter what they need. We've got color coding on our warnings and things like that. So this is a relatively small change. We didn't have to build out entirely new backend. With every engineering team, you're working with limited resources. You're really thinking about how you can do more with less. This is just an example of the ways we've been able to see sort of incremental efficiency gains as we continue to build on Retool.
Definitely. I think that it really sticks out to me here is just focusing on the highest leverage activities that you can accomplish in Retool. So I think the workflows piece is one that was using an antiquated process. It wasn't really scalable or maintainable. So that required a larger overhead and to push all invest into Retool. But then here you have a small tool that can automate something that would take maybe, additional time, day after day. And that can be done in Retool within a couple minutes. So there are many ways that you can approach Retool. And I think you've showcased some of the ones that your team has relied on. Is there anything else you want to touch on in terms of demo before we move on to another section?
No, I think let's move on.
Great. So I actually see a lot of questions that touch on hiring and development, and how do you actually think about structuring an organization built around Retool and this new paradigm of tooling. So I wanted to spend some time digging into this, and I know Anna has done a lot of thinking around it, and Dapper has kind of shifted their structure as well. So And I'd like to talk a little bit more about how Retool has influenced your vision for hiring. And now that it's more integral to your tech stack, how does it actually change the method for hiring and growing out your team?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. I don't have all the answers to that yet, but I would like to share some interesting insights that we've picked up as a team along the way. So, one thing I want to highlight is how our partnership with Retool and the nature of tooling work has really provided a unique opportunity for our engineers to expand their skill set. So, we actually have two engineers on the team, one who is Ralph answering all the questions in the chat right now that started out in customer support. Retool created a really ideal environment for them to build and quickly iterate with low friction. So we were just talking this morning in our stand-up about the pains of, rerunning your tests, waiting for your files to build and compile and all that stuff. Retool really streamlines a lot of that to let you write code, tangibly see results without dealing with all that boilerplate, all the infrastructure, the deployment and things like that. It's very streamlined. So for Retool, we generally see it as the front end piece of the tech stack, but I also want to share a piece of feedback that I actually got from one of my backend engineers because I thought this was really interesting. He mentioned that backend engineers, they normally set up their services, they build out their endpoints, and then they pass that API to the front end team to create that final solution, that last piece that the end user sees. With Retool, he can spend the majority of his time building the backend work that he enjoys, but then he can put that last bit of effort, hook up that backend code using one of Retool's many integration options, and then ship an end-to-end experience all by himself. So it really lets him see the direct impact that it has on the end user. I saw a couple comments in the chat that these look like tools built by engineers. That's because they are. And that's something that we take pride in. These are engineers that have really been able to build out full stack solutions by themselves. So they can deliver that value without having to wrangle with things like HTML or CSS. You also mentioned hiring. So we have actually noticed that because we work with Retool, we've adjusted how we hire for this team and this role. To put it simply, Retool takes a lot of complexity away from the development process. And, when we first started building out this team, we thought, okay, we'll have Retool engineers that will work with admin APIs that other teams provide us. This didn't work because ironically, the work was too simple. The team wasn't feeling challenged by this. They were finding that the balance of the amount of work was also off. Teams would spend weeks building out these endpoints, and then we would come into Retool, and in a matter of hours, it would be integrated. So we've actually made a shift to specifically hire for backend engineers because this way they can build out the backends that these Retool pages rely on. And we're finding a balance of like 5-to-1 or even greater of backend work to front end work lets us ship these full stack solutions. So currently, we're the only team that's sort of hiring for backend only because traditionally at Dapper, we've hired front end or backend specialists and then built teams comprised of both. But once again, just because of the way Retool has covered that front end of the stack, we find that this just works best for us.
Great. And I think you might have already covered this mostly, but I saw a question by Gabriel that had some upvotes on whether or not your engineers work full-time on building solutions in Retool, and then what skill set you are looking for in an engineer. So maybe if there is anything else you want to touch on in terms of what you're looking for when you bring on new folks to the team.
Sure. So I would say we definitely do not build full-time in Retool. To put it simply, we're not at a place as an organization to do that. That isn't to say that, one day we won't have full-time Retool engineers, but a lot of the tooling that we need, there isn't a backend for it yet. So to give you an example, there might be a specific admin action that we want to take on a user's account. We may not have the endpoints to do those actions, so there's nothing to build in Retool until that's done first. So our team handles a lot of the backend work that props up these tools as well. And I would say that accounts for the majority of our effort. The other question was in terms of sort of hiring and what skill set we look for. So I think this is pretty common on internal tooling teams in general from what I've seen. Internal tooling teams tend to not always have a dedicated product person or a designer or anything like that. For us specifically, because of the scale of the company that we're at and just where we are, we find that engineers that are product oriented and have sort of that interest in the business context of what they do tend to work really well on the team. This also ties in with our partnership with Retool as well, because Retool does give you a lot of flexibility and let you iterate quickly. I'm often finding that I'm not, dictating to my engineers what they build. We will sort of brainstorm on a problem together and they will present a solution that they think works for the workflow. A lot of our customers actually don't have a product person as well. Our customer support team doesn't have a product manager. So this works really well because we'll collaborate with them to understand their problems, but ultimately our engineers will design a solution around their workflow.
Great. Yeah, I completely agree. And I was actually able to visit Anna and her team in person. And the one thing I noticed is one, that all of her engineers are very much business focused. They want to make sure that whatever they ship is actually applicable to the end user. And then what I also realized is that they are able to do a lot more with less. So like Anna mentioned, much of their time is not actually spent in Retool, but they're able to now spend a lot of their time actually building out net new functionality, including backends. So for other teams, they kind of work in a hub and spoke model. They have this centralized tooling team, and then a lot of other tools rely on them. They can actually go and build out backend APIs, net new services for these teams, and then create Retool apps on top of those, which might have taken months or even longer to do if that team had to own it itself. So this is where we can see kind of that net new value versus just acting reactively to what is needed on the existing data structure in place. So I think it's really interesting to hear how that's evolved. Another question for you, and I see, is that there's a lot on how much growth we've seen. We see 100 apps here, and we see that there's a lot of teams relying on you. So I kind of want to go back to this project management pieces. How do you think about drawing boundaries between apps? And this also leads into the future of what does this look like in the grander scheme of things? Do you think that you're going to continue to have a centralized team? Do you think you might decentralize it across different teams? Do you have some insight into what that might look like in the future?
Sure, sounds good. So I'll touch on this question first of drawing boundaries between apps. I think Luke touched on it as well in the chat. So we have over 100 apps, but not all of them are as full-fledged as the ones that I've demoed. There's sort of that decision between adding more to an app and compartmentalizing specific functionality. Sometimes teams have very niche use cases to do one very specific thing. Now that our company has grown, I think we're at over 500-600 individuals. We have certain individuals that are very specialized in what they do. So they may have an app that does something very niche to their workflow, and they don't need to see everything else. So that's a little bit about when we would build out a new app or separate out functionality, is just essentially when it makes sense to do so. It's a little bit of a cop-out, but there's sort of a judgment call to be made there. So in terms of the longer term direction of our company, as I've mentioned earlier, I think we're really just at the start of the company's adoption of an approach to internal tooling. In the long term, we probably will see a shift to a decentralized approach to tooling. Sachin, this is something we've talked a lot about. You've mentioned you've seen your other customers adopt this model, where we will see tooling efforts integrated into each team and tackled by respective product engineering teams as opposed to one tooling team. This is probably still a ways out for us. In the meantime, our team is focused on a couple of things. So one, continuing to identify workflows as opposed to specific actions that we can consolidate and support in Retool and with our tools. Two, building solutions that are versatile and extensible across multiple products. So like we talked about, building something for NBA Top Shot, being able to use it for NFL All Day as well. And three, just creating a center of excellence where our team can act as a resource for individuals on other teams that want to build tools themselves. So I saw a question in the chat about whether we offer internal webinars or internal adoption sessions or anything like that. While we don't have anything formal, I can tell you I've seen an increasing uptick of people reaching out to my engineers to ask, how do I do this in Retool? What's the best practice for this? Because over time, we've sort of just gained that knowledge. So as a company, we're really excited to see how our dedicated efforts towards internal tooling will continue to evolve and grow with our products and organization.
Got it. And then do you think that things will change in the future in terms of the product development lifecycle or the ways that these inflows of requests come in, or do you think that it might stay the status quo?
Oh, absolutely. So we've already seen a shift here. I think, I want to reiterate that this isn't sort of just we adopted Retool a year ago. We decided to build tools a year ago. So as a company, this has been a huge learning experience. I suspect some of you in the webinar today are going through the same place we were at a year ago, or maybe where we are now, where it's a shift to sort of our entire our entire life cycle of our product to integrate tools into that. So one thing that I've noticed is that I'm finding better ways for us to work with our customers, the teams that we serve, to sort of scope out their pipeline and refine the requirements of what we want to build. For example, one of our best customers, our live operations team, when we first started working with them, they knew they had these problems in their workflow, but they weren't really quite sure how to build tools around that or what tools to even ask for. They've since brought on a product person that specifically works with them, with us. So a tooling live operations product person. We have a much more formal process of evaluating the effort that is needed for some of these tools, the impact that will be made so that we can stack rank them and pull tasks off the top of the stack. So just little things like this where, we're not trying to add overhead or unnecessary process, but we are getting a lot more organized with how we approach tooling. And a couple of reasons for this. One is because we need it, but two, because I think we've also validated as a company that the value of doing that is there. The ROI of having this dedicated individual is there. So I think we'll continue to see that in the future.
Great. Yeah, completely agree. I see a few other questions and I want to make sure we get to them. So I see a lot of questions on the Zendesk integration. I know a lot of teams build on top of Zendesk and they want to see how to use Retool. Do you think you can touch a little bit more on how you use that and what the integration looks like?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, I think this integration is mostly limited to us pulling information from Zendesk into Retool to surface that information to our agents for now. However, we currently are working on a exciting project. Victor in the chat is actually one of my engineers leading this project, where we will be building out a center where you'll be able to see all the actions that we've performed on a user's account. So this will be linked with Zendesk to surface information from Zendesk, but also, if needed, back to Zendesk. So an example of this, sometimes we will gift users items, maybe because they participated in a site event, maybe because something happened to their account. We just want to keep track of these gifts that we've gifted to an account so that our agents can make a decision as to, this person already received a gift from us this month, or this person spends this much and they should qualify for a gift. So things like this, where this is not to say like we're taking data from places and then we're going to show it in one place. This is data that maybe we currently don't have, the support team doesn't have access to at all. It might live in databases that they can't access. We have risk analysis software that our support team may not be able to access. So we're going to build out something in Retool where they can see all of this, and then we can surface things back and forth between Zendesk and Retool.
Perfect. Yeah. And just another question on just the tooling you use to manage flows. When you do have new requests from end users, how do those get propagated into you? Do you use something like Linear or Jira to track these? And then is that how you do project management for those?
So we actually, in our portfolio company, we have a project management tool called ZenHub. So that's the tool that we use. It's built into GitHub. It's very similar to Jira or Trello, but it's integrated into GitHub. So that's our project management software. And then in terms of how we actually sort of get these requests, it's a combination of having regular syncs with our sort of end customers. So for example, the support team and we meet weekly, bi-weekly to talk about sort of how the tools are going, what they need next, what they see on the horizon. Sometimes they'll open requests for us on our issue board and things like that. If you're thinking that, meeting with the team weekly maybe doesn't seem like the most sustainable thing or the most scalable thing, this is something we're doing once again because the concept of a tooling team is still very new. So I can see one day in the future something that's a little bit more process heavy, a little bit less ad hoc, but at this point, this is what works for us.
Perfect. Yeah. I see some other questions. I want to make sure we get through as many as we can today. So the next one is more on just like the metrics and adoption piece. So once you build tools, what are the ways that you evaluate the success of them? Do you work with the teams individually? Do you have any dashboards to check that? I know you've used the usage analytics app that Retool has built as well. Are there any other methods that you have in place?
Yeah, so things like usage analytics, the audit log, things like that. this wasn't the question, but it also addresses sort of the audit and compliance concerns. That has been really helpful. We also rely a lot on the teams to give us feedback in terms of not what's being used, but what's working for them. So, sometimes we'll build tools, and because we're not the end users of the product, we might not get it right on the first try. It can be as simple as, just renaming a column name to be more intuitive, or reordering the tables or something like that, resizing a modal. So we really work with our end users to kind of refine that workflow and what they want to see. So for a lot of you in the webinar today, I'm assuming you either work on internal tools or you're interested in internal tools. So maybe you already know this, but when your customers are your colleagues, that feedback loop tends to be really tight, and it's really easy to get that feedback. We collectively want to succeed. They want us to build better tools. We want to build better tools for them. So getting that feedback isn't necessarily an issue. It's more just being able to turn that into actionable items and figuring out what makes the most impact.
Great. Thanks for sharing.
I
know this is a topic that we are continuing to work on as well, but there's some questions around like permissioning. I know there's a specific one on the password protected page that you put externally, and then you also have, of course, internal applications. How do you all manage permissions? And of course, we've had a lot of discussions on where we're going with this, but what is your current state for managing those? And what is the application that you use for the external user?
Sure. So we use Okta as a company. We have role-based access groups that we've set up outside of Retool. Just that's how we've decided as a company to manage permissions, and Retool does support pushing those role-based access groups into Retool, so we can leverage those specifically to grant access. So for example, we can say all the front-end engineers that work on the NBA Top Shot product, they would have a role-based access group. Once again, that's not something we set up for Retool. We use it for all of our apps. We can push that group through to Retool and then assign specific folders, specific resources to that group. We have seen sort of, as we build more tools and we have more employees, a shift in how we handle permissions. I think we try to be a little bit more scalable now with our approach, because at the beginning we were like, let's create a group for every app we deploy. We'll give exact access to people to what they need. Obviously, since we have 100 apps now, that's not practical. But because Retool does allow you to sort of have these groups pushed through, people are already grouped together by their function. So that helps us out a lot.
Got it. Yeah, and we are also really invested in this permission-based piece as well. I know that as teams grow, there's a lot of requests for types of granular access. So we're working really hard to create a more robust, scalable system here as well. A few more questions, and I know we're jumping around a bit, but there's one on around the percentage of internal tools that are cross-team versus team-specific tools. And yeah, I think that's it. So how many of your tools are going towards separate or multiple teams, and then how many are going towards a specific team?
Oh, I'm not sure. I saw this one in the chat and I ignored it because I wasn't sure if I knew the answer. So I will say we have tools that are built for a team, and then we have tools that are built for a product or a feature, and then anybody can use them. So for example, we have tools that are built for the support team, for the marketing team, but we recently launched a feature called NFL Playbook. So we have tools specifically to highlight information around this feature, and then any teams like the marketing team, the support team that want to look up information about this feature or perform certain actions on a user's account related to that feature, there's these tools as well. As far as the breakdown, I'll let my engineers chime in the chat, but I want to say it leans toward team specific. And the reason for this is because we often find that even with these feature-based tools, over time, we'll start to see distinct workflows appear from different teams. And at that time, we might decide, okay, instead of having a team look at all the stuff that they don't need and really, have to filter through for what they do need, maybe it makes sense to diverge and make 2 copies, one for the marketing team, one for the support team.
Got it. Totally makes sense. And I think we kind of saw this already in some of your earlier examples, is the way that you're creating patterns of reusable components, and then the ways that you can apply them to different teams and try to leverage some of this utility that's already built in. Cool. I see one more question I want to touch on is this experience of users and builders onboarding to Retool, and then how that has become more expedited as you have more teams building or more engineers building, and then how you've started to create a sort of center of excellence internally. I know that Ralph has done some work on creating some best practices, but how do you think it scales, and do you think it's helped with this onboarding flow into Retool?
Sure. So I think there's two parts of this question. One is bringing on more consumers, and one is bringing on more builders. I'll talk about consumers first. So being able to use the permission groups that we've already set up, that obviously helps a lot. For example, certain teams have certain folders in Retool that we've granted them access to. So when we want to build for them, we just put it into that folder and they see it right away. We also, because we reuse modules, we reuse certain UX best practices, people are familiar with that process or that user experience. So it's sort of more intuitive to pick up with newer tools. That's some ways we help with the consumer onboarding. With builders, one thing that we're seeing is the way that Retool is set up, even if you're not reusing a module or a component, it's pretty easy to find something that does something similar to what you want to do. Or, if you're not sure if the best practice, you can find a tool that maybe is a little bit similar. So we're able to take learnings from the apps we've already built and essentially reapply them. Like we might copy over queries, but we'll just make a certain tweak or things like that. And then, like you mentioned, our engineers have also taken the initiative to create best practices and things like that. These are resources that we can share with other builders coming on. The last piece of it is setting up some of those resources for the first time, setting up authentication for the first time. We did that pretty early on. So that's all pretty much ready to go. And even if we do, want to connect a new database, we're following a very similar pattern to what we already have. I think we see more friction with onboarding end users just because their use cases are so different. With onboarding builders, I think we're at a pretty good spot where it goes quite smoothly.
Awesome. I appreciate you sharing that. And I
Of
think
course.
that's our goal too, is Retool, is to start to share these learnings, both internally. We want to share this with customers. And then for customers that have this platform built out, is to also do some shared learnings internally. So I think the way that you're approaching it is spot on. So I see one more question, and then I think we actually did already cover this a bit, but maybe we can drill in a little bit more, is the project and development teams and how whether or not there's singular product owners, and then gathering requirements and grooming the backlog. So my understanding is currently there's some teams that do have PMs. Most of them might not have that. And then those requests for teams will come in directly to you, or it'll go through your ZenHub integration or your ZenHub view. And then you'll take those requests, and then those will go directly to the engineers who will then work on those features.
Yeah, so one thing I want to say to this is I'm very fortunate that I have engineers that are very strong in this regard when it comes to sort of drilling down on the requirements, scoping out a feature, sort of really honing down on what the tool needs to do. I think you touched on this, and this is something you notice at the onsite as well. So I'm going to give a shout out to Luke. He's in the chat too. There were a couple things where, our live operations team came to him and they said, we have this particular problem. We don't really know what the solution is. We don't really know what the tooling around it needs to be, but we just have this problem. Couple examples. One thing, we wanted to be able to see at a glance that the packs that we were minting were correctly randomized. Another thing, we wanted to be able to hide stuff on the website that we weren't ready to market yet, so it could be a surprise when we launched it. So things like this, it wasn't entirely clear what the tool needed to be or what the solution would look like. So for this, we work very closely with the teams that we service to figure out a solution that works for them, and sort of to drill down on what makes the most sense without too much effort on our side. So it is still ad hoc in some ways. I think this tends to be common for internal tooling. So like you said, sometimes there is a product resource on the team, but sometimes it's a matter of just collaborating with them and going back and forth. And I don't want to say that this is something we've solved with process, because I don't want to take away from the fact that I just do have engineers that are very strong in this regard.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And I think it is very much dependent on the company, how they operate, and then generally like what the scope of work is. Sometimes there's some big problems out there that might require some product management and figuring out exactly the features that we need in Retool. Other times there's a specific feature set that we can port directly. I think this covers most of what we needed. I know there are still a few questions out there, but want to make sure that you can get those answered. So please do feel free to email myself, and I can pass on any of those questions to Anna and her team. My email is Sachit, which is my first name, @retool.com. And then I'm happy to help get those answered. Really big thank you to Anna and the rest of the team for joining us today. I know Ralph and Luke and Victor are all in the chat and have been really helpful. Roy as well for answering some of those questions. I've found this really helpful, and I'm excited to see where Dapper goes with Retool, but appreciate you giving us your time today, and I hope others found it helpful as well. So thanks all for joining, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you all for coming, and thanks for having me.
Thanks.